So when I was young, I grew up hunting with my dad out in the middle of nowhere, way out in West Texas. From our house, we'd get up, we knew it was an 8-hour drive, and at about hour 7, we'd always turn off the highway, we'd go through this gate, and for the last hour of our trip, we would drive through cow pastures, we'd be snaking on dirt roads, going through this never-ending scrub brush and never-ending cactus, until we got to the old goat barn that was our home base. Some of y'all might remember me talking about this earlier this year, that I talked about how I loved going out there because I could look up and the stars would just go on forever, as far as you can see. And one of the things I remember about that even now, even though I may not get to go out and see those stars at the goat barn again, is that those same stars that are blotted out here by all the light in Sugar Land in Houston, those stars are still up there, even if we can't see them. One time we were out hunting after Christmas. That was a time when everybody who hunted on this land would come out and be together. And for the first few days, we had a camp full of people sitting around the fire, telling stories, just enjoying being out in God's creation. But as the days went on, people would get their deer and go home, or they'd come up short and move on to go hunt somewhere else, until eventually, a few days in, it was just me and my dad. And it felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. We would go out and hunt in the morning. We would go and drive all over fixing feeders and throwing out corn in the afternoon. We'd hunt in the evening. And one night we had done our daily routine and we came back, we cooked dinner, and we were sitting around the fire playing chess with this chess set I had gotten for Christmas. At one point my dad took his turn, he moved his piece, he stood up and he said, "I'll be right back, I just got to go get something from the car." So I'm sitting there and I'm looking at the board and I'm thinking about what move I'm going to do because I desperately wanted to beat my dad in chess. I might have beat him once or twice here and there, I don't know. But I was thinking about my move and out of the corner of my eye I can see my dad. He walks over to the car and he clicks the door and he walks over to where we were staying and he looks around. He picks up his backpack, going through it. And he did something that I knew wasn't a good sign. He did that pat on the front of your pockets when you know you're trying to find that thing, but you know that thing's not in your pocket, right? So my dad keeps walking around, and I kind of get this sense of what is happening. But he comes over to me with his voice a little more on edge than when he left, and he says, "I can't find my keys." The game was over. We looked in every bag. We looked in every pocket. We looked everywhere that we could with flashlights out. And I told you how many stars are out there. It is dark. You cannot find a whole lot. But we came up empty. We could not find the keys to the car we came there in. We had the keys to the hunting Jeep, which we were lucky if it turned on. But we didn't have keys. And suddenly that feeling of it's me and my dad and we have the whole world to ourselves, that world suddenly felt a little bit bigger because now we had the whole world to search for these keys. It didn't take very long in that moment for the fear to set in. What are we going to do? How are we going to get out of here? We're not an hour away from town. We're an hour away from the highway. Once you get to the highway, it's still another 30 minutes or so into town. This was in the early days of cell phones. My dad had a cell phone, but it might as well have just been one of the other rocks on the ground. Like, there was no service out there. The goat barn did not have Wi-Fi. There was nothing we could do. As we kept checking down our lists of possibilities, what can we do? How can we get out of this? We kept coming up empty. And the further down the list we got, the more the fear started to set in. Until all we could really do was look at each other and say, "We have no plan other than wait till morning when the sun comes up and we will keep looking. But until then, we have to go back to the fire. We have to somehow sleep tonight. We just have to wait. There's nothing we can do." Now, I don't want to spoil the story for you, but we did make it out of there. We drove the next day. We got the hunting Jeep running, and we retraced our steps across this ranch to all the feeders we had gone to, all the corn we had thrown out, and we finally, my dad walked around a cedar tree, and the keys were just laying there right on top of a flat rock. It was amazing, just like that, the fear that had set in and the relief that just empties it out. See, that's the thing about fear. In the times and seasons in our life when the fear starts to set in, don't get me wrong, there are things worth fearing. We all go through seasons of life like that. But what does fear do when it sets in? Fear starts to warp and distort. It gives us tunnel vision so that we can only focus on some things and not see the other things that are around us. But at some point in those seasons of fear, when we are prone to being warped and distorted and not seeing life as it actually is, we have to find our way to some sense of trust. We just have to wait. We just have to wait for the sun to come up. We just have to wait until we can take another step. But sometimes you're powerless to force that on your own. Each summer for the Sundays on either side of Vacation Bible School, I like to preach from some of the verses that our kids are going to learn through the week. Part of that is so that our families are all on the same page and they can talk about what their kids are learning when they pick them up each day. Part of that is so that we, the church, are all on the same page, that we can all pull in the same direction and we're all learning together. But it's important to me to preach these VBS verses each year because sometimes the things that our kids learn in VBS get written off as kid stuff. Those are the things you learn when you're a kid. Those are the things you learn when you go to VBS. But the thing is, sometimes it's the kids' stuff that we adults who are working out how to live out faith in our everyday life in a complicated world, sometimes it's the kids' stuff that we need to be reminded of. Sometimes it's the kids' stuff that we need to go back to those basics and ask ourselves those tough questions, because if we write it off, we're often missing foundational pieces of our faith. Each day this week, our VBS kids are going to hear some story of Scripture where life is uncertain, where life does not go according to plan, when bad news shows up, when the fear sets in and starts to warp and distort. And the kind of home base verse that they're going to come back to day in and day out, it comes from Psalm 56:3, and it's a very short, simple verse that reads, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." That's why we have Trust God on the front of our VBS shirts. It's a short verse in a much longer psalm that comes from a story in David's life. When he felt like his time was up, when the knives were out, when the armies were closing in, and he did not have a plan. But it was in that moment he says, "Whenever I'm afraid, I put my trust in you, O God." Today I want us to jump into one of the stories that our kids are going to learn about. We're going to look at the first scene in the story of Ruth. It's a story from the Old Testament. We're going to jump into it in a little bit. But if you know the story of Ruth, you know that it is a story of life not going according to plan, of desperately trying to figure out what is the next step, of fear and despair setting in and warping the world around the people of the story. But I think that if we can hold up this story to the light and look at it from different directions, we can find in this story of fear and despair a simple but powerful lesson of what it means to trust God in the unlikely ways that God is often at work. So today, instead of reading this whole 18 or so verses to you, I'm going to read the first 2 verses from Scripture, and then I want to tell you the rest of the story. I've done this before, but just letting you know. Let's jump into it. The first bit I'm going to read is from Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. This is a simple enough setup for a story, but the very next sentence changes everything. It reads, "Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died." There's no explanation, he just did. And after their father dies, the 2 sons marry women from their new home, this country of Moab, and one's name is Orpah and one's name is Ruth. And life goes on more or less how they planned normally for the next 10 years. But then suddenly the sons, just like their dad before them, they die too. No explanation. They just did. So now Orpah and Ruth are young widows, and Naomi is left with no husband and no sons. And in the midst of this grief and of this loss, Naomi hears that the famine, the one that caused them to leave Bethlehem in the first place, the famine is over. There is food again. There is more than enough to go around. So she decides, why would I stay here in this place of grief and loss and death? I'm going home. Empty-handed, alone, but I'm going home. Naomi looks at her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, young widows, and she tells them, this is what we read in verse 8, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of a new husband." At first, both resist. This is a huge change. They say, "We're going with you." But Naomi says, "Go home. Go home. Why would you stay with me? Why would you come with me? I'm not going to have any more sons. I'm not going to have another husband. Even if I had another husband and I got pregnant tonight, that son still has to grow up. Are you really going to wait around?" I know wrapped up in all that is sort of the practices of the day of who got to marry who, what, and when. Doesn't really translate to how we live today. But the point here that Naomi is trying to make is that there is nothing for you in life with me. There's nothing for you here. There is no future if you come to me. Look at me. My family is dead. If you don't want to be like me, go home. Naomi ends with these words. She says, "It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." In other words, Naomi, in her loss, as the fear and as the despair has set in, this isn't a bit of bad luck. This isn't just tragedy. In her mind, the very God that she followed had turned against her. At this, after her big speech, through tears, Orpah does what she says. She goes home. We do not hear from her again. But Ruth will not go. Ruth says to Naomi, "Do not tell me to leave." And in a speech that is well known, she says, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." And the final verse of this first scene ends with this. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. And that's how this scene ends. Not with two people holding on to each other or embracing each other or encouraging each other or telling them, we can do this, we can face whatever comes our way. We're more or less left with a woman who is broken and grieving, who tells someone to go home. They say no, and she sort of shrugs. Okay. There's nothing left to be said. Let's go. We don't have to go further in the story of Ruth to see that this is a story of intentional contrast. Sometimes stories in Scripture are stories of intentional contrast, meaning they are meant to challenge you. They are meant to shock you. They are meant to tell you that you don't have all these things figured out as well as you think you do. Think about the story of Job. Job is a story of intentional contrast that challenges the ancient idea that if you're a good person, God gives you good things, and if you're a bad person, then God gives you bad things. It's an ancient idea, but it's still very much ingrained in the ways that we are prone to think. But in the story of Job, Job is a righteous man who does nothing wrong. He's successful, he's wealthy, he has good things, and seemingly overnight he loses all of it. It challenges that idea that people who are suffering and people who have lost things must have done something to deserve it. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. Or think about the Good Samaritan, the story that Jesus tells. This is a story of intentional contrast. When Jesus looks out at the people who knew the law, who looks out at good people who called themselves God's people, tells them the story of a man who was beaten and left for dead on the side of the road, and the priest walks by him, and the Pharisee walks by him, and the only person who stops to help this man is a Samaritan. In that day, Jews thought Samaritans were less than human. They could never be God's people, and yet when Jesus tells this story, it is meant to challenge that God is at work in people you don't think are good enough. Ruth is in that tradition, in the story of intentional contrast. But the thing is, we're living in such a different time, place, and culture that we might miss the things that are meant to shock us. Let's go back and break this down a little bit. In the midst of a famine, a man named Elimelech, which is a hilarious name, moves his family from Bethlehem to Moab. That would have shocked people from the very start. Because Bethlehem is a part of Israel. It is the domain of God's people. Do you know what the word Bethlehem means? It means literally house of bread. There is a famine in the house of bread. There is not enough to go around in the house of bread. And so a good God-fearing person, Elimelech, packs his family up and heads to Moab. Once again, shock. Because if you read around the Old Testament, Moab is a recurring villain in this season of God's people's life. They go to war with Moab. Moab is thought of a place of people who are completely immoral with weird sexual practices, who make sacrifices to backwards and vicious gods. In the eyes of God's people, the bread of Moab was not fit for feeding God's people. It was only fit for being sacrificed to these lesser gods. But Elimelech does it. He leaves the house of bread where there is a famine and goes into this place that God was not at work, at least in the minds of God's people. Elimelech goes and he immediately dies, which to the people who were hearing the story, they would probably think, well, what did you think was going to happen, man? You went to Moab. His sons marry Moabite women. Once again, shock value. If you read around the Old Testament, one of the things that is condemned again and again and again are God's people marrying foreign women. It's just, in their mind, this is the source of your problems. They're only going to give you trouble. They're only going to lead you astray. They're only going to make you sacrifice to other gods. They're only going to make you worship idols. Some scholars think that the story of Ruth, although it is set in one time, was written in another, in the rebuilding of Jerusalem by Nehemiah and Ezra, where Ezra and Nehemiah's work was so focused on rebuilding the culture of God's people that there is a horrifying story in Ezra where Ezra essentially gathers up all of the foreign wives that have been taken by Israel and runs them out into the desert because they are seen as sources of sin. But here, Elimelech's sons marry foreign women. And in 10 years of working, 10 years of living, they die. Once again, people would say, what did you expect was going to happen? Look at the choices of your life. Look at what you did. And now we are reading this story, hearing what is going to happen to these three women who are left alone in the world, in a time where to be a woman left alone in the world was a death sentence. The only question was how long the sentence was going to take. This is the moment where the fear sets in. This is the moment where the worst case scenario gets a little bit worse. But these three widows, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, as they figure out what they are going to do and how they are going to survive and what they owe to each other, Ruth sticks by Naomi's side. She continues to be a contrast in a story of intentional contrast. Because in this time of desperation, Naomi can only think of herself and her own worth by whether she has a husband and whether or not she has sons. She looks at Ruth and says, I'm too old. I can't give you anything of value. Therefore, I am not of value. You need to go and carve out a life of worth on your own. But Ruth sticks with her anyways. Think back to her speech. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. Y'all, that's a level of loyalty that is expected of husbands. To the point of wherever you die, I'm going to be buried right next to you. This is a picture of loyalty, devotion, and trust at the highest level. And it does not come from the people who are called God's people. It comes from the unlikeliest of characters, a Moabite woman who would have been seen just in that of itself as not worth your time, but she is also a Moabite woman who is widowed and has no sons. This is, in the pecking order of the ancient world, she is as close to the bottom as you can be. And yet in this story, she is the one that is reminiscent and reflective of the loyalty, love, and devotion that people associate with God. These two women, Naomi, a widow from God's people for whom life has not gone according to any sort of plan, and Ruth, a widow from the enemy of God's people. If we hold these women side by side, we can start to see the simple but powerful truth of what it means to trust God when the fear starts to set in. Because for Naomi, when that fear sets in, it warps not just how she approaches the situation, but it warps how she views herself. If you read on a little bit further, Naomi and Ruth walk back to Bethlehem, and when they are greeted in Bethlehem, someone comes to approach her and says, "Oh, it's Naomi. How are you? How's life been?" And she says, "I'm not Naomi anymore." Naomi, translated, means pleasant. She says, "Call me Mara," which in the language means bitter. She says, "Things have gone so bad for me, I'm not even that person anymore. Call me bitter. Call me bitterness. That is the only thing that has grown in my life." When the fear has set in Naomi's life, it warps and distorts so much that she cannot have a view of who she really is. She only defines herself by the bitterness that has taken root in her life. I think another place that fear distorts in her life is how she values herself. She can only think of herself as someone that matters if she has a husband and if she has sons, and without those things, she sees herself as worthless. I think it also warps and changes how she sees the world around her. When Ruth gives this speech of, "I'm with you, I will die beside you, I'll be buried next to you," this extreme level of devotion, what does she do? That's the kind of love and devotion people spend their lives longing for. And she has it right in front of her face, and all she can do is, In that same conversation where she tells the person that she's Mara, she's bitterness now, she says, "I left Bethlehem full and I came back empty." It's distorted her view of the past, because guess what? She didn't leave Bethlehem full. She left because there was a famine. And she didn't come back empty. Make no mistake, tragedy happened in her life. But she came back with someone who was devoted to her in love. She did not come back empty. When the fear set in her life, it distorted things to where she could not see herself or her worth or the people around her. The same is true for me and you. In the seasons of life when we are prone to let the fear set in, the despair, the frustration, the burnout, the exhaustion, it will warp the way you see yourself. That you are only the sum of your mistakes, or you are only as good as you are useful, or that you are your accomplishments, or you are your degree, or that you are whatever it might be. Fill in the blank. There are many ways that we revert to a distorted view of ourself, a distorted view of our worth, and a distorted view of the world around us, where we can become so fixated on a set of particular issues, or become so fixated on what we think we are owed, or what we deserve, or how people ought to treat us, or what politician we're mad at this week. Whatever it might be, we can get so focused on things that give a distorted view of the life we are called to live. But Ruth, again, gives us contrast to that. Ruth, I think, if we hold up and look at her character, she gives us an example of what it means to trust in God. Now, trust in God, what does that even mean? It's one of those churchy phrases that feels like it can mean whatever you want it to mean. And I think for a long time, trust in God has been a code word used by slick guys preaching on Sunday mornings to mean, just do whatever I tell you. Or I think sometimes trust in God has been a phrase that means, well, agree with the right ideas and God's going to give you everything you want. Or trust in God has been, I'm just going to wait back and do nothing and wait for God to swoop in and fix this mess. The idea of placing our trust in God is complex. And we come to understand it in different ways. But I will say this, I think the foundational truth of the idea of trusting in God is that trust is not passive, trust is active. Trust is not passive, trust is active. What I want our kids to learn in VBS this week, and what I want us to learn as we think about the story of Ruth today, is that same sense of trusting in God is not passive, it is active. And here's what I mean by that. You trust by the ways you live out the things you say you trust in. If you say that you trust in God's forgiveness for the things that you have done wrong, then it means you must go out and live that forgiveness that you trust in. That trust is not just for you, it is something that God works in and through you for the sake of other people. If you say you believe or you trust in God's grace, that it can work in your life to transform you into the person you are called to be, then it means you must go out and live out that trust, both that God is at work in you, but also to trust that the grace that you show to other people is a way that God can be at work too. Trusting in God is not passive, it is active, it is lived out. It is something that we invest our lives into. It is not waiting for God to swoop in. It is not letting bitterness set in when a broken world keeps serving up brokenness. It is trusting that the things that God has called you to do will show you a way forward. It is trusting that we make the road by walking, not by sorting it out all in our head before we take a step. And that when we commit to treat people with the love and grace that we know in Jesus Christ, we are trusting in that love and grace to help us make our way in a world that is not going to serve up love and grace on its own. Trust is not passive, it is active. Now, you might hear those words, and you might be someone sitting here today in a season of your life where you can relate to Naomi. Maybe you're sitting here thinking life has not really gone according to the plan. This is not where I thought I would be. Maybe you are carrying around grief and loss. Maybe you are exhausted by feeling like you have no options for the way forward. Whatever that might be. If that is where you are, what you need to seek out are ways of connecting with God and others to where you can take a step back, take a deep breath, and you can look around you for the Ruths that are in your life, for the people who love you and care about you, for the people who are devoted to your well-being. And if you feel like you don't have any of those in your life, give me a call, because I can be that person for you. Now, maybe you hear Naomi's story and you say, you know what, life is fine, life is good. I'm not worn down, I'm not worn out, I'm not swallowed up in grief and frustration. That is good. That is a blessing. But if that's where you are, your job is to seek out the Naomis and to be supporters and lovers and carers of them, encouragers of them. Because your life, if it's going on track, if it is going according to plan, that's great, but it's not all about you and how well you're doing. Part of what we do as followers of Jesus is that we do that trusting in Jesus, trusting in God actively, not passively. If you read the rest of the story of Ruth, and I think you should, it's not a very long book and it's a powerful story. If you read through the rest of Ruth, you will find that it is a story that starts out with emptiness and it ends with fullness. Because Ruth goes on to become married to a man named Boaz, and she has a child who is then the grandfather of Jesse, who is in the line of Jesus. It is Bethlehem, after all. And you'll find that ultimately Ruth's active trust that God was going to work this out means that she, a Moabite woman who had no reason to stick by Naomi, who didn't really want her there in the first place, who gives herself in love and care and devotion, not knowing exactly what comes next, but being active in that trust, this Moabite woman who nothing good was expected from God's people becomes someone in the line of Jesus Christ. Someone who, even before Christ shows up, the story that came before him in the genealogy of the people before, there is a story of active trust that brings, that starts with emptiness and seeks to bring fullness. That is what we celebrate in Christ, in the life of Christ. That in all that he did, he didn't just walk around giving out ideas and preaching good sermons, but he took people who were left behind of nothing expected of them, people who were hungry and people who were sick, and he cared for them. He took people who were empty and gave them fullness.